Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to talent, culture, and the finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Justus Kilian. I'm a partner at Space Capital. We invest in seed stage companies. Today I'm joined by Matt Gjertsen of Better Everyday Studios. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. Hello.
And Seyka Mejeur of AdAstra Talent Advisors. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks, Justus.
Awesome. So the question I wanted to pose to the group actually came from one of our listeners, and he's relatively young in his career. He's had a lot of very interesting and promising internships and is looking at, some of the most well-respected companies out there. And one of the things that he's looking for sort of help and guidance on is what are the best strategies for determining what a company's culture is truly like before joining? Everybody has similar statements on their websites, and, it's kind of hard to sort of like filter through the fluff and the marketing and, what they say to like what the actual day-to-day is like, both at like a organizational level and then also down at a team level. And so culture is so important, particularly for, attracting, the best talent. And so, I think both of you have worked with great organizations. You're recruiting these people, you're helping place them. I'm hoping you have some, helpful insights in this topic. Seyka, do you want to sort of share your insights first, being on that sort of front edge from a recruiting standpoint, being in the middle?
Yeah. So I have a lot of questions for the person asking this question. So some of the places that I would start is understanding what sort of culture they are attracted to. What do they want to be part of the culture that they are involved in? And then my second question is, are they looking to kind of pre-qualify as best they can the organizations that they're going after before getting involved in the interview process? Or are we looking at this from kind of throughout the interview process and kind of getting alignment there? So really cool question right off the bat. I think that before you're connecting with the team, identifying who is already part of the organization, where they've been before, and what they've accomplished. So if you're looking for a lot, it depends on what you're interested in. And there are a lot of assumptions that people who kind of are in the inner circle, if you will, or understand the essence of different organizations and different teams within organizations, you can actually make a lot of educated guesses and pattern recognition just by seeing who's in the organization and who is on those teams, right? What they've been able to accomplish and what sort of period of time, et cetera. So I think that's step one for before you're actually having conversations with people. Once you're actually having the conversations, you're in the interview process, I'm looking for, one, asking people directly what the culture of the organization is and asking similar prompts across a variety of interviews to see how much alignment there is. If you're seeing pretty conflicting cultural identities within an organization, that's something to pay attention to, right? If you're seeing a lot of alignment in how people are approaching the organization, that's a pretty great sign of it being something that's more reliable information, and then you just have to understand if it resonates with you. And there are a lot of different things to look at when it comes to culture. I am a huge fan of, you've listened to our shows before, you've probably heard me say it before, I'm a huge fan of not looking at a lot of cultural elements as good or bad. They're just information and they are good or bad for you, right? So being clear about what you want and what is compelling to you is of the utmost importance, because it's going to help you ask very intentional questions and understand what the company is all about. Now, one thing to look out for here, and I think a really insightful kind of aha moment is in your question itself, is that a lot of these cultures look similar. That should not be, right? Unless you are targeting, maybe we're talking about a subset of 3 hard tech companies, and you're like, cool, they're all started by people who came from similar teams. All right, great. Maybe they really do have the same culture. When companies are representing their culture, the way that their culture is represented should not be trying to please everybody. It should be trying to scare away the wrong people, right? It should be unappealing to some of the people who will read it. And if you're trying to go, hey, I kind of want to catch everyone, then you are going to miss the people who very strongly align with your culture and your values.
I love that. That's super clear. And I think the most recent example that I've seen of that at like a really powerful level is Anduril has just went on like a major marketing campaign after they've raised a ton of capital and like, recruiting a bunch of people. And they're basically like, you shouldn't work here, right? And like they're basically telling people, you don't want to work here unless you look like this. And they're being like very explicit about that. So
the Don't Work at Anduril campaign, like I probably drooled over that like 20 times. It is so fun. Both in the phrasing that's being used, because that is their whole point, right? Is, yeah, we're not for everyone. And so if we are for you, we mean it. And then also just the visuals of them literally like painting the town in Don't Work for Anduril is just, oof, gets ya.
And that was, it's the same kind of idea that was embodied by the original, Netflix culture deck 15 or so years ago. That was the whole point, is they wanted to clearly spell out, this is who we are, this is how we operate. Don't work here if you're not gonna thrive in this kind of culture.
And I wonder too, a lot of the startups that we work with, they start with some brilliant engineers who are like, the tech is what matters. And yes, culture, right? Everybody should work hard and want to build cool stuff, and we'll bring the best people in and the culture will kind of already align. And taking time for the narrative, both on the narrative for culture and on the narrative for why this matters, are really important pieces that I think can get skipped early on. And I will say it until I'm blue in the face that those two things matter, and they're not kind of these, soft, wishy-washy, unimportant things that we kind of like slap color on. But the top talent that we're connecting with, truly, the three things that matter the most to them are working on novel technology, like challenging novel technology with really smart people for an inspiring mission. They want to be doing something huge with the work that they're doing. And so I've heard, truly, multiple founders have said to me, yeah, well, you get people who just want to work on really hard tech. And I think that we're seriously missing how powerful the narrative piece is, and not just saying it because someone told you that you need to have a mission, but like getting it in your bones and being willing to stand there and have brilliant people walk away because they don't fit.
I love that. I think it often gets lost, particularly at early stages, why culture matters. And we've talked about this in past episodes, that if culture exists, whether you intentionally define it or not, it's, a result of the founders and how they showed it up on a day-to-day basis. And if you don't define it, and if you aren't intentional about how it's communicated, and don't set, a set of, guidelines by which people are trying to operate, it's going to be defined. It's going to be existed, and it's probably going to come across in a way that isn't what you intended. So you're probably going to lose some really great people as a result.
It's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. You risk keeping the ones that are not a strong fit, and you risk losing the ones who are.
So Matt, how does this translate then into leadership, developing the right people, and sort of retaining those people? When you're coming in and you're, how does this translate?
Yeah, I think first I want to kind of double down on what Seyka said about the importance of understanding what you're looking for as a candidate. And I think asking questions that are really specific around that. I remember the last interview process I went through, I had a young family. And so I was just very explicit, like, look, I'm going to leave at 5 so that I can go home and have dinner with my family. I'm okay, cracking open the laptop after that and doing some more work, but I'm leaving at 5. And because I was very clear about that, and it was okay, and it worked out. But so when you can, I think, be extremely explicit about things. When I go into, I've done interview training for new managers, and I think one of the things that's really important in that training that can go into this for candidates as well is kind of the intangibles of how the people show up, not just what they say, gives a lot of insight into the potential culture of a company. So, are they taking pause? Are they is the interviewer asking the interviewee question, or giving the interviewee time to ask questions, right? Do they create that space within the interview so that the candidate can ask their own questions? Is the interviewer on time? Do they show up late, are completely distracted, are checking their phone? Like those are things that are going to indicate, okay, chances are like that's kind of the culture of the organization. And I don't know about you, Seyka, but I also think the hiring process as a whole can give you a lot of insight into the culture of a company. Is it organized? Is it timely? How many decision makers are involved? If there's 300 decision makers involved in hiring somebody, or they have 12 steps in their interview process, then it's probably a company that has a lot of process and steps, and has difficult and takes a long time to make decisions. So I think there's a lot of information that you can gather just by kind of observing how the interview process happens and how the interviewer shows up to the interview. I think that can be really important, even outside of any direct questions that you ask.
I think that's awesome. Another one that comes to mind there is follow through. It's a big one. A lot of candidates are seeking, organizations within RE mentality with extreme ownership. And a lot of companies are representing themselves as companies like that. And then when it comes to the interview process, one side is really dropping balls. And to be very aware that is a signal. There's maybe a little bit of grace in the very early stages on the candidate side if we're pulling somebody in right before they're fully engaged. But if you are an organization that takes, like, for example, an AdAstra core value is because I said I would. We follow through. You close the loop. Always. And that's a core value from AdAstra. And if someone is not fitting that throughout our interview process, it is a clear sign that will be painful on both sides, right? I can imagine someone coming into our organization saying they're going to do something that maybe doesn't even feel like it matters too much, right? Okay, I'll shoot you that email by the end of the day, not following through, and then having someone on the team go, hey, that was actually like a big miss. I know it was not an important email, but you said you would and you didn't, and that's a big problem. And then that person now feeling like, oh, come on, you're making a big deal out of nothing, right? I think that's a really specific example of how not aligning with a core value could really take somebody in a bad direction with an organization.
I love it. Matt, I wanted to ask you is there a way to glean insights about culture by looking at the tenure of, people at the firm, their growth in terms of roles and development in terms of, maturation as managers, as leaders. The most direct way to do that is, to try to have conversations with people on the team or at the company just to understand culture. But is there patterns that can be sniffed out just by doing some research on the team that tells you anything about that?
I think so. Glassdoor is definitely a thing. LinkedIn Insights will show you tenure and things like that. But I think, and so you can, but only to a certain level. It's just like, I talk about the iceberg model of various things lots of times. There's the stuff that you can see above the surface, and there's the stuff that you can't see below the surface. And I do tend to, so something like tenure, you gave the example. If there is a really long tenure in an organization, generally like 10 plus years, those tend to be organizations that, promote people relatively slowly. They're very stable. They're and you can expect that the culture will be a kind of what you might call like a more traditional culture. If you're looking at a company that has a tenure of less than 18 months or something like that, they have really high turnover. Chances are it's pretty chaotic, and there might be some things going on there. But those are only surface level indications, and there are so many different reasons why those kinds of things could be happening. I think that's where asking more specific questions within the interview process, like I know doesn't always apply to startups where a lot of times a role that's being hired for, it's the first time that role exists. But one question that I've heard people like to ask a lot is, why did this position open? Like the person who left, why did they leave? I think trying to get some of those insights through the interview process rather than just assuming that based on outside indicators is probably a better way to get the information, I would think.
So this is for both of you. I don't know if there is meaning in this, and and maybe it just goes back to there isn't a right or a wrong fit. It's just knowing what's the fit for you. But companies will have to lay off people at some point. And there are some companies that try to do that very thoughtfully, right? And they're very public about how they do it. And people express in detail the packages and the support the managers gave them to try to transition, And some companies are just like, we have a strategic change, we wish you the best, goodbye. A lot of that's still public, right? People's frustration, people's experience, and there's been a lot of that's happened over the last 5 years. And so you could learn a lot. Like, could you learn something about the culture from, going back in time and actually sort of unpacking that? Is there relevancy there?
I definitely have thoughts. Seyka, what do you think? Okay, so because I've been at a company that had a mass layoff, and I've seen a lot of them happen. There definitely are examples of bad, like really bad mass layoffs, but I've kind of reached the opinion that I don't know if there's a good way to do them. Like, you can be as thoughtful as you want, and it's just a crappy situation. I know because the one I went through was at SpaceX, and if I describe it to people, they're often shocked. Oh, shock horror. I personally think it was one of the best ways they could have handled it. Like, I just don't know, because the alternative that people want it to be slower, so that they can have more personal interaction. But then it's like, okay, so you have your whole workforce like under the axe for weeks at a time, worrying every time they get called into a meeting that this is going to be the meeting where they get laid off. Like, and so there's certainly a personal preference and a life situation preference that's going to weigh into this. But I guess I would say there's certainly bad ways to do it, and you can probably learn something from that. But there's also no good way to do it, and so I think that's kind of where I come down on
it. I think I'll echo that. Yeah, there are some bad ways of doing it, and if you were pretty compelled by an organization that you saw had done something that you deemed, I actually, I think that this is pretty fun to expand even broader than a layoff scenario. If there's a company you're pretty interested in, but there is some significant moment that doesn't align with you culturally, right? Be that a layoff or some scandal in the press or something, right? Do you then say, well, then that organization is not worth considering? And I think that if you are quite compelled by what that company is doing, you have other reasons on your pros list, it's worth having the conversation, right? There's a good chance that someone says, wow, that was an atrocious thing that happened. We have learned so much from it. I'm glad you're asking the question. Let's talk about what we learned. And if so, there's certainly a path back to that actually being a learning opportunity where you go, hey, we actually are really aligned. You were able to take that hit, to learn from it, and to adjust. So I think it's probably the right answer is in the mix of all this information that you gather, but being able to identify that it's something that didn't align and then ask those targeted questions, I think is really going to get you to the place you need to be.
And I think it's so important to ask those questions because we've all had the situation where, we're watching the news and we're generally accepting it. And then the news has a story about something that we know deeply about. And we see that the news story is entirely wrong. And so it's important to remember that, like, again, above the surface, below the surface, like there's a lot that's always happening below the surface. And so, yeah, if you're on the fence where there's that one thing, like, I just can't abide by this, chances are there's more to the story. Take the interviews and then make sure to ask about that and to have your questions answered.
Well, this was really great. I think that there's a few things that stood out to me in all of your insight here. I would say the first and biggest thing that stood out to me was there's a lot of prep work that is required, that the onus falls on the individual, the candidate who's looking at the job to say, like, what am I looking for? What's important for me? What culture will I thrive in? And without that, you can't really have a thoughtful engagement or dialogue with a company because you don't know what you're trying to match against. So it sounds like a lot of the work is actually up front. Seyka, I really liked how you said, and we've talked about multiple times, there's not really good or bad. It really is like, what is that right alignment for you? And so making sure that ties. When going into the conversations, looking for consistency across the observation points that you're seeing once you do clearly know what you're looking for is an important way to surface it. Also expecting that, like, the company should be helping people opt out. They shouldn't be making it comfortable for everybody. And, if that shows up in your interview process, you should notice that as a red flag for you and, maybe choose to opt out. And then, Matt, as you were talking about really the intangibles of how people may say something, but like how they physically show up and engage with you and what their follow through actually looks like tells you a lot about what is actually done within the organization versus what is said. And so you really need to pay attention to those cues. So I think, this was great. I think there's a lot of practical insight here for anybody trying to, like, parse what culture looks like and how you actually can find a fit for yourself. So thank you guys for helping unpack that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.